Good evening. This is Sonica, 10th anniversary edition. Hello, Globe. We're being filmed. We're being watched.
Oh, great.
Huh?
Oh, great.
Yeah. More material for Uncle Google and Brother Facebook. So it's 6 p.m. It's time again for, I guess, this week's final roundtable discussion. The title is A Class of Its Own, on the question of class in contemporary music. This is the promise, this is the premise. Contemporary music is far from beyond the question of social class, but it seems it has lost the sensitivity for it. The question of identity, internalized and externalized. The question of gender, embodied. The question of social class, now that's a question. How does social class condition contemporary music? How much class awareness or identification is there in contemporary music? How do production and distribution, consumption and reception influence the construction of class? What kind of music or sound is or could be the pretext or subtext for the struggles and movements for a better tomorrow? Or indeed, their vehicle, their mobilization force? What music is the music of the precarious or creative class? What about the working or consumer class? What role do music genres and spaces play in the construction of social class? So, the panelists with me here today, 𝐏𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐊, Vidmar, Sean Brady, and Sarah Lauzemis. As we're being recorded, here's a little intro about each panelist, though Facebook knows it all already. Google probably too, so, sorry guys, you can take a break now for the next 5 to 10 minutes while I introduce who the people, the panelists are. So 𝐏𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐊 Vidmar, sociologist of culture from Ljubljana, holds a PhD in sociology from University of Ljubljana, works as a self-employed independent researcher, music journalist, reviewer, translator, lecturer, columnist, and radio host. He writes essays on music and current problems in culture and society for a range of academic publications. Since the 80s, he has worked as a music critic and cultural journalist for most of the main media outlets in Slovenia. He was music editor and a full-time head of radio programming at Radio Student, Radio Student. He is a member of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music and author of Nova muzika v New Yorku, Neodvisni glasbeniki in pravica do mesta, New Music in New York, Independent Musicians and the Right to the City, published in 2017. Sean Brady is an American writer and editor-at-large from Chicago. He primarily works for Tiny Mixtapes. I think we have some fans of Tiny Mixtapes among us. I've been hearing, Tiny Mixtapes. He has also written for Pop Matters and The 405. Specializing in DIY music scenes, he has also written various essays on music and intellectual property law. And Sarah Lauzemis was born and raised in Brussels. After a bachelor's degree in applied communication studies, she first started as an intern at Sematics. Am I pronouncing this correctly? Sematics, yeah. Sematics in 2010, a former festival which belonged to the 𝐏𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐊 network. So 𝐏𝐿KAS, for those who've just joined us over video, is International Cities of Advanced Sound. She then rapidly became involved in the European project 𝐏𝐿KAS as the junior project manager for Sematics. She finished her master's degree at the Faculty of Philosophy in Brussels with a final thesis on the 𝐏𝐿KAS network in 2013. She then continued her path as a cultural worker at the 𝐏𝐿KAS member SOCO Festival in Montevideo, Uruguay. Since 2014, she worked on different occasions for the TTM Festival in Berlin and finally co-founded the festival 𝐏𝐄𝐓 in Brussels in 2015, a partner organization of the European project SHAPE. For those who have just joined us over video right now, SHAPE is Sound, Heterogeneous Art and Performance in Europe. In 2016, she joined the 𝐏𝐿KAS Management Board. She lives between the 3 Bs, Brussels, Berlin, and Barcelona. Right. We haven't managed to save the world yesterday or the day before, So
I keep my expectations low.
yeah, no pressure, no pressure. So let's start with a fundamental. Well, here's my first point. Let's assume there's little or no class consciousness amongst at large, but also amongst cultural workers, artists themselves. I think one would imagine we or artists or curators see themselves as producers, as consumers, both ends. There's, of course, they produce reflection as well, they consume reflection. But, would any of these describe themselves as workers? If so, why? To what extent do they identify as workers? Why? Why not?
First of all, I would like to complicate a little bit the things. We're talking about social class here in music and arts in general. But usually the question is what is social class actually? What is the conception of class in nowadays capitalist society means? And if we are in some way very insensitive toward this question nowadays, I can recall one statement from American billionaire Warren Buffett, and I will quote, it's not direct quote, but in one of the meeting of businessmen in the United States 10, 15 years ago, he claimed, there's a class warfare going on and we are winning it. So class consciousness about capitalist class is quite clear. In this respect, they exactly know what are they doing. So this is first thing I'd like to add to this. My position all the time is when we are talking about music, contemporary or music in capitalist societies, in living capitalist society, is always let's see if we would examine the whole process of production, distribution, and consumption. I would like to stay contrary to the major stream of cultural studies, and I think first of all to the point of production, music making practices actually. And I can tell you this. I have here one quotation. 5 years ago, in New York City, when I was doing research in New York City about independent musical formations, I met my dear friend Anthony Coleman, composer, musician, pianist, doing also electronic stuff, whatever. He has been part of New York City downtown scene from the beginning of the 80s, so he's now a veteran. He lives in East Village. He's a teacher in Boston, in New England Conservatory. He lives in old tenement building that is under old city rent stabilization protection. And I was asking him, as like everybody, as I always ask my friends, oh, so as a musician, how is a musical life? And he was answering, well, it's very busy. Between teaching and performing and doing my own stuff, touring, lots of gigs in New York, tons of gigs in New York. And I was curious, well-paid gigs? No, but there are still tons of them. This is actually the actual life of musicians nowadays in the touring circuits. We are talking here about touring musicians. So I would like to start really with this. I mean, we are talking about musicians, especially independent professional musicians that are in the market. They're trying to live from their music. They're trying to perform their music in live. They're trying to sell their records. So why not to start with them, to see what is this laboring men and women doing, musical laboring men and women doing. We have, the other point I have is we are in city in Ljubljana. One of the major topics in past 2 years, everywhere, including Sonica Festival, including Mint Festival, including round tables and conversations with various various representatives of so-called music industry, organized by SIGITS, which is our informational music center, is around music business. And I was counting a little bit. Interlocutors, I mean guests, were always representatives of the labels, of festivals, culture politics, representatives of municipalities. There was no musician involved in this conversation. We are talking about music business, but without the very working force actually who produced music, who are actually the real producers of this music. So why, I'm asking myself, why are they exempt from these conversations? It's ridiculous, actually. Even ordinary music club, even ordinary restaurant with music will play the music who is made by someone. It's not, but we are always inviting to these roundtables, festivals about creative industries, networking. We are always inviting, I mean, the representatives of distribution channels, presenters. So we should ask more ourselves, what is actually the nature of a musician? What is his social position? And if immediately when you switch from the definition of musician as an artist to definition and to perceive him as a music laborer, we are on different terrain, and then we can start to talk about class, actually. And because he's a part of majority of them, they are part of the, let's say, creative individuals, as low-paid, even precarious worker, like low-paid, precarious worker, everyday worker, working and creating in more and more degrading conditions. That's when I should start this discussion.
Okay, let's locate this at the epicenter of the keywords: creativity, experimentation, innovation. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit compared to yesterday, and let's locate the person as a producer, as a self-producer, self-promoter, self-brander, self-employer, self-creator, self-innovator, and so on. So we've extended the notion of a worker. I want to push it into the 21st century, and so we have an ultimate worker actually, who's everything, not an entrepreneur.
You're talking now about self-employed worker.
But without the awareness or the consciousness of being a worker. Is that the case?
I do think that there is a lot more work that a musician is expected to do. It's, especially in the case in America, you have to put in a lot more work to get anywhere within a scene, within a larger scope of a particular genre. But at the same time, that's always been the case. And I'm speaking on an American context. Many of the things that I've seen within the various DIY spaces that I've worked in is that you see a lot of just planning to do these big events, and you kind of just know that they're not going to pay out all that well. But the point is not to get a good payday out of it. It's just to get people in there, just to get people into these shows, to get into these events. And the thing is, especially in America, there isn't a lot of help that's going around in that respect. I cannot speak entirely on the context of Europe, for example, but in the United States, the only chance you can get even grant money or even just some money to get your project rolling is usually through a nonprofit organization or even through a private company. I mean, we've discussed in the last few days Red Bull Music Academy, and many people are have a lot of antipathy for it. at the same time, if you look at it from an American perspective, it's like, well, that's
how it is.
they're paying. Why should we be so concerned about the logistics of it? And of course, I mean, with America in particular, the discussion of class is very complicated. Like, a lot of people don't recognize that, at least from a European perspective. But there's a lot of different factors going on within the context of class. And I mean, the only people that tend to recognize it are like the fringe people on the left that exist in America, because left has a very weird terminology within American culture. It can mean a lot of different things when it's not leftist, for example. And then you have the capitalist class, which obviously they recognize the threat of the masses actually moving towards redistributing wealth or any other means, or the means of production, back to them. So you only have these two groups. One is very small and has very little power outside of certain politicians, and one that's very small as well, but has an enormous amount of power and influence. So the thing is, like, with a musician has to really strike it out on their own in many ways. And I think it's a necessity within the American context, no matter what happens. And it's barring some major changes within the cultural cachet, for lack of a better term, it's unlikely to change anytime soon.
Well, of course, the question is extremely complex. Depends where you put the focus, of course, talking about social class and musician. If we talk about musician, what kind of musician are we talking about? What kind of music branch or genre are we talking about? Are we talking about the electronic music scene or the profile generally, even though we start to see progress there, is male, 35, white, middle class? Are we talking, which kind of context are we talking about? From which country are we putting the perspective? Then, of course, there are many things which have to be put into consideration, and then the factors or the way the path for a musician, or to be really a musician, or to consider like as a worker musician doing everything from A to Z, depends really on the context. I like to take the example of a rapper from a French suburb. Of course, his aspirations and his context has nothing to do with someone maybe from the middle class in some other, like could be even Paris, doing electronic music. It's like has nothing to do. So what are we talking about? Where do we put the focus? And talking about social class, it has to take so many different things into consideration. And the question, we of course inviting a musician would be good. Like in this case, I understood it as a critique. At the same time, then what kind of musician do we invite then? If we take, it's like so complex because it will be maybe in this situation either we take 3 different kind of musicians with 3 total different backgrounds, but otherwise if it would be again, sorry to say it, like a male, white, 35 average, we tap again also in a kind of discussion which is quite dominant. So for me, it's like, where do we start from?
No, I would start immediately here. First of all, let's face it where the music now stands in global scale. First of all, music is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Never mind which kind of genre we are talking about. Music is everywhere. We are waking up with music, and we are going to sleep with music, whether we want to do it or not. It's on the iPhones. It's in advertisements. It's in the restaurants, on the streets, whatever. The second, every music now, every genre, including classical music, now is of course it has a status of cultural good, and of course it is commodified. Almost every aspect of music now is commodified. So it means that it's sold and consumed as cultural goods on cultural markets. Is it right? So it doesn't exclude any musicians anymore, actually, especially in Western society, if you're talking about at least semi-professional musicians. And every music is mediated, of course. So there's no differences. If you're talking about the profile my colleague was talking about, that's true. Usually, yeah, 35 male middle class from intellectual family or not would appear as a musician. But if we are talking about immediately, if you talk about that, we are talking about musicians on the market and about class relations and possible class transformation in this society, and I'm very pessimistic about. We are talking about the possibility, very possibility and very real possibility, and which is sometimes or quite often reality, about the exploitation of musicians. That is one of the definition of class, at least in let's say in Marxian theory. This is one thing I would like to emphasize. So, and of course, in history and even now, we have forms of self-organizing of working men and women. Never mind, I'm not talking about industrial, traditional industrial working class. About new, actually, people who work and try to live from their work. We have traditional and new forms of self-organizing about this company. One traditional would be unionizing musical work, and we have still quite strong music unions, or you have different independent so-called self-organization of musicians, associations and so on. And I mean, when I was reading some of their programs, most of them were trying to control actually output on the market, whether via goods or via record companies, festival organizers, and so on. So this is one of very important aspects. So they are not excluded from the mass of dispossessed people in the world. And finally, if we talk about class today, actually I would say that even independent musicians, and we are talking mostly about independent musicians, not musicians with regular jobs, let's say for orchestra, which are mainly unionized in England or in Europe or even in the United States. For instance, New York Philharmonic is unionized orchestra with payment wages between 80,000 to 120,000 per year, with good healthcare and security. We are talking mostly here about independent musicians here, actually. So if we're talking about possibilities, how they work as an independent musician, and they will work mostly for and they will fight mostly for the better conditions of the work and the payment, which is like actually fair remuneration for the work, and they will seek for it. Or we will talk even for fight for the space, mostly urban space. These are all the part of the contemporary struggles of, let's say, musical labor. So this is for me quite real options, and I actually analyze a few of them. Another point about talking about class in music, and I'm not talking now about social content in very music. I'm not about musical form itself, in sound itself. I'm not talking about that. This is a very Adornian theme, by the way. I'm talking about actually relations of production, actually, here. So about the conditions of music labor here, mostly independent, self-employed music labor. So in this respect, they are not so further away from everyday worker everywhere. So they are part of, let's say, I would say most of them, majority of them, they are part of the subaltern groups with no access to social, political, and economic power. That would be one broader definition which moved a little bit from the orthodox and Marxian definition of class and class struggle, but it doesn't exclude the moment of economic relations and relations of exploitation and relations of domination. That's it.
Well, again, this is the epicenter that I'm interested in. So how this is the group or social cluster that feels these conditions most. No, the lip service is it's being creative, it's being innovative, it's being experimental, it's being through networks, festivals. This grid is becoming a global community in a way that's very much internalized and externalized identity politics. It's being inclusive, it's being diverse, all of that. But so they're feeling it in a way. Are they promoting the cause, the class awareness, class consciousness?
I want to answer that question by answering another point that he made. One of the big points that was just made was regarding the issue of access to urban spaces, and this is actually one of the essential problems within DIY scenes in the United States. Currently, right now in the United States, there is a significant housing crisis. Basically, what we're seeing here is because many workers are now starting to push, that have been for decades living in the suburbs, are now starting to push back into the urban areas there where they once lived. We're seeing this massive conflict come into play. And in that, we see the basic concept of gentrification take form. And it's usually these DIY spaces that are in basically the front lines of these conflicts, that are essentially class conflicts. Because on the one hand, you have these small communities, not just of DIY spaces, but also migrant communities, minorities, and other groups living in these spaces because rent was cheap, this was the only place they could live, etc. And on the other side of it, you have developers, real estate developers, who are buying out these spaces for the purpose of earning money off of them. And usually they do this by buying out the space, maybe renovating it, but that's not a guarantee, and then jacking up the rents to a point that these people are kicked out, and in their place are white-collar professionals, basically, who are earning six figures a year. And the issue with that, of course, is that it means that it's much harder to maintain a space, especially an informal space, because there's basically two sides to the DIY equation. One is the formal spaces, usually spaces that are helped run by a nonprofit or through a group of people, or even just like a small venue where they're running art-based stuff. Like in Chicago, a good example is the Hideout Inn, which runs the Resonance series, which is a special experimental series of music shows, and that happens once every month. And it's a great way for more avant-garde, more experimental regimes of music to enter into the Chicago scene, for example. But yeah, there's these formal spaces. They get taxed. They work closely with the city. They work in some ways with the city government over zoning and other matters. And then they handle, they're basically the public face. And then you have the informal spaces. These are just people who just rent out a warehouse space kind of under the table, or they just use their apartment basement or house basement to set up shows. And right now, the big issue is that the informal spaces are dwindling, and the formal spaces aren't necessarily able to recover this from this, recover the losses from this. And part of that is due to this conflict between developer and community. And in many ways, you see developers pitting community against community. I lived in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago up until a couple years ago, and occasionally you would see English and Spanish posters that, for lack of a better term, they mocked the typical white hipster, quote unquote, as being, they mocked them, but also perceived them as a threat to their way of living. Because the way that some of these people see it, these people are considered like the canary in the coal mine. in a sense, they're a warning sign that something is about to go wrong in the community, that developers going to be pushing in. And that, I think, is basically that's underselling what's actually happening. Basically, these people are being pushed out from another space because they can't afford the rent. They're basically suffering from the same problem, and the real enemy, quote unquote, is not looked at until the very end. By that point, the damage is done. People start getting kicked out of places. People are moving to new locations, and communities get torn apart. Or in the case of DIY spaces, we disassemble and then try to reassemble elsewhere. So it's a very distinct, the big issue at that is that urban access is going to be the issue that affects all this, and it is a class conflict.
I would like to pick up on this. I guess it's not only the question of urban access or urban space, but also the question of mobility. How is your access to mobility, especially being a musician? Again, there are certain factors or certain contexts which might make it more easy or less easy. And one of the main factors is the passport. If you don't have the right passport, you will have a big issue as a musician to travel around the world and to make your gigs. But we all know that selling CDs is not. It's totally 20th century. So we all know that basically a musician makes his living out of the amount of gigs he's doing. And so if you don't have access to mobility because you have the wrong passport, or maybe because you live in an area where it's too complicated, well, you have a big issue as a musician. So it's not only the question of social class, but also the question of mobility and who has access to mobility.
And I think there is definitely that. I think in the case of America, the case is simply more just a matter of income, because the cost of living varies dramatically from one area to the next, not even just urban to rural, but also from city to city. To give an example, Chicago is a very expensive place to live. It's one of the top 10 cities in terms of average rent in the country. But it's still pretty low on the scale in comparison to a place like San Francisco, where I witnessed the art scene in San Francisco just completely die. And what's left there is not, I wouldn't even qualify it as much of an art scene. And you're starting to see you start to see Oakland, which is right across the bay from San Francisco, suffering from the same effects. And then you have smaller cities to give an example, Asheville, North Carolina, Louisville, Nashville, Tennessee, and Detroit, all these other spaces where it's much cheaper to live. However, the problem with this is that cost of living is very much a big role, but the wages usually match up with the cost of living. So if you want to move to another city, say if you're going from a very expensive city to a lesser city, it's pretty easy to move to that direction, but it's extremely difficult the other way around. You have to save a lot of money, you have to do your footwork to get a job and make sure that you have something that will sustain you for a while. And that's such a big role in that.
Two things about gentrification. Character definitely we are talking about class character gentrification here. But if we're looking really analytically to the problems of gentrification, I was doing research for 7 years in New York, because New York is a prime example of what happened with the urban space and the gentrification, actually, from the late 60s onwards, beginning with lofts in Soho and further in Lower East Side and so on. And now, when I'm observing various facets of gentrification in Ljubljana, I think this is gentrified actually restaurant. Actually, I think that it is, especially its neighbor, its patron. Actually, it's mayor of Ljubljana. We cannot actually leave out the role of artist communities or even do-it-yourself communities of artists, because they are really on the urban front line of gentrification. Actually, objectively, as an actor, sometimes they act as a pioneering gentrification liners in the urban area, and how they consciously react to this position where they are put into action. They're forced to that. They're searching space for creativity, for living, and of course they will look for it where it could be found. I mean, found. It would be found where, of course, in ex-industrial complexes like in Soho, in warehouses in Soho, or will they find in a poor migrant working class communities like in Brooklyn, now in Queens, even in Bronx, or in Ljubljana, or elsewhere in Brussels. I suppose there's the same situation or whatever. So we cannot exempt we have to take really seriously the role of the artists. And when I was in this process, and not without moral judgments, actually. It is the part of political economic process in urban restructuring of the cities. Fight for space, for living space, is one of the crucial for the arts and for the, let's say, poor and working class, mostly immigrant communities. And when you're acting like intruder, sometimes acting like an intruder, or occupier or pioneer in such communities, when you come from like middle class artists, aspiring artists with finished university or music academy, whatever, of course sometimes you forgot that you are socially not sensitive enough to see that you are actually coming, and you are with perhaps better equipment, better solvency in your pocket, and you will, of course, somehow push out existing communities. And when I was observing these struggles of artistic communities and struggles of immigrant communities, mostly working class communities in Brooklyn, and also in part of the Queens in New York City, that was the case and still is the case. Some artistic groups and musicians groups, independent, let's say musical formations, were aware of that, and they were collaborating with existing immigrant working class communities in Brooklyn, and they were confronted with the city authorities and imposed urban plans for restructuring, renovation, revitalization, which ordinarily means building condos for 4 or 5 million for rich people, and let's say 10% of that condos would compose, let's say, of condos with regulated rents. Some of them, they didn't care at all about that. They were like aiming for the higher artistic goals. So this is about one of the theme of the festival is oversensitive or sensitivity. This social sensitivity is very crucial for me when I'm observing what artistic groups, individuals are doing. When I will observe and I will notice that these artists, which are the part of the, let's say, artistic proletariat in the city, are doing things together and sometimes fighting with immigrant working class communities in some areas, then I will actually rate them much more higher than when compared to other artistic groups or individual artists who will pursue just their individual higher artistic goals. Very simple.
If I may,
Yeah.
one thing I will note is that in America, there are two distinct types of gentrification that are eminent. One is the more traditional kind that you have seen in New York, that you see in many cities that have undergone urban renewal in the last, I'd say, 2 to 3 decades. There is a second form, however, and this is the one I witnessed in San Francisco. And basically, what happens is that there is a massive influx of cash due to a specific industry, in this case, technology. And because people want to live in the city, want to live in the city life, you see this massive influx of cash from people who have high-paying jobs. Usually, we're talking 150 to 250,000 euros a year as an entry-level position or even a mid-level position. And that money is going towards buying up houses and paying ever higher rents because the landlords recognize that these people are willing to pay through the nose for rent. A good example of this occurred to me about 5 years ago. I had an artist friend who eventually became a UI designer for a tech company down in Los Angeles. And he was living in San Francisco at the time in this warehouse district known as Soma, south of Market. And this is a tale I tell everyone about. And basically, he was living in this warehouse building where the entrance of the building was in an alleyway, which is a fire code violation. The stairs were creaky. There was cracked windows. The roof was leaking. The bathroom, if you went inside, even though it had a nice little jacuzzi tub or whatever, looked very incomplete. You see exposed piping and everywhere. And I'm pretty sure his room didn't even have a window. Like, it was a very low quality space, and yet he was paying $2,000 a month at that time. By now, I'm expecting it to be closer to $3,000, $3,500 a month just for this room. And the reason for that is because landlords know that they can get away with this. So when you have this massive influx of cash happening, basically, instead of it just being like planning and just the more traditional sense of just like planning these spaces and renewing them, people just grab property whenever they can get it. And maybe they renovate the place, maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just hold on to it so that they can sell it later. Or maybe they can just buy it so they can flip the home, which is a term we use to describe a house that's just bought, fixed up, and resold as sort of like this form of investment. And which is part of the real problem with housing in America, is that it's treated as a commodity, an investment commodity. And consequently, you see this massive explosive growth of all these housing, of all this housing just being gobbled up. And it just functions more like a virus rather than a war. And there's no real way to control it. Eventually, it spread to Oakland, and that's part of the reason why I moved out of Oakland back to Chicago. It's moved out up north to Portland, Oregon. It's moved southeast to Austin, Texas. And it's moving to all these other little spots. One of the big news stories of this past year in the United States is this campaign by Amazon to create a new headquarters. And the great fear that comes out of that is you're going to have a repeat of that to whoever wins, which is partly why I breathed a sigh of relief when Rahm Emanuel decided he wasn't running for re-election, because I'm pretty sure we're not going to get it. So,
Okay. I'm not going to treat it as a natural catastrophe. I'm going to treat it as something that needs organizing and mobilizing. So I'll return to my point of departure.
Maybe some immunization, that's all.
I'll return to my point of departure, to the creative, experimental, innovative worker music class that's, I guess, traded its right to the city or its right to social security for freedom of expression, freedom of experimentation, freedom of creativity, and freedom of mobility, I guess. Let's assume that. But it's, though serving still the, being very much a part of the platform or festival industry, it's one of the most mobile, interconnected, globally aware, I guess, proverbially inclusive, diverse bunch of people. I see so much potential for a movement, not only a social but a class movement there. Why isn't this potential being tapped into?
Oh.
Do you want me to start first, or I mean, you can go.
I could. I'm thinking at the same time. So
Yeah.
No, start you, and then I will take it just after.
Okay, that's cool. I guess with America, it's like it goes back to the problem of how class is in the United States. It's very complicated. Let's not mince words there. Part of that is simply because American history is filled. If there is a general reference to American history, is that a lot of the capitalist class has made various efforts to suppress any sort of ideas related to class. And this goes back to the late 19th century, goes up to the 1930s. Like, you would have labor strikes that would be put down by the United States military, or indirectly through the National Guard. So there is always this sort of like suppression element. Another part of this is the matter of race. It should go without saying in the American context, and any leftist any Marxist who argues otherwise, I think they're a little foolish to suggest this, but class in the United States has a very racial element to it. For the better part of 200 years, the economic system in the United States, back when it was in the colonies in the 17th century, was built to some degree on chattel slavery. I hope I'm pronouncing that first word right. And by the end of the 17th century, it was codified that this particular chattel slavery would be imposed on a specific race, and that is to say slaves that had been brought from Africa. And when you have this sort of situation where a single race's social relationship with the means of production was for the longest time a matter of being free labor, of being slaves, it changes the cultural context in relation to other races and to other parts of society. And to address this, to sort of unite the classes in this, to unite the working class or the lower class or the precarious class, one has to take that into consideration in the United States. It's not exactly the easiest thing to do. It's doable. You see this happening in various fits and spurts with the labor movement in the 1930s, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, the Rainbow Coalition of the early 1970s. But it's a very difficult process. And it's not... Like, you still see the effects of this model, of this economic model, even today. I mean, we talk about segregation in housing, for example, and that remains a big problem in Chicago. And consequently, you have music groups that don't mesh up, like even among the fringes of the DIY scene, like South Side and West Side's hip hop scenes don't mesh with the North Side in terms of like either rock or punk or electronic music or any of that sort of thing. You don't see much meshing all that often. And because of that, there's not a lot of interaction. So it's a risk.
So is the focus on identity and expression, deluding us from emancipation and solidarity?
Well, always get the first branch of it.
I was trying to help.
No, it's maybe I will just go back a bit before. I want to talk about the United States. I have no clue. It's very interesting, but it's not at all in my range of knowledge. Just to go back to the question of the movement you were asking before. In the case of Europe, maybe, I mean, there is, of course, you see influences from everyone. Every musician is influenced by other kind of music in his genre, generally. So, of course, probably we cannot talk about... if there's a kind of mobilization, a kind of movement, it would not go through all music genres, as you just have also pointed out about the different genres which exist, but more within one. And this already existed. I mentioned before the case of rap. Rap, again, I would say is coming back and is coming even in a different way. Also, there's like all this trap movement, which is very interesting. As much in the United States, also in Europe, in different cities or countries. But I probably see it more like genre-related and not totally as a music movement, because people don't belong to the same social class, then again, don't belong to the same context, don't have the same issues. And then also within Europe, of course, if you grew up in Germany, or if you grew up in Belgium, or if you grew up in Spain or in France, the 4 countries I know the best, it's not, your issues are not the same, your context is not the same. So you relate to each other cross-national, but from certain points, and you cannot never totally link to the other from all contexts, from all the sides. So I still think there's hope, and music is, for me, always also related to politics. It's a political act. And then it depends. Like experimental scene, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of connections. There's a lot of stuff going on. Often it's more in a niche-related scene, but there's an awareness. And there's many issues which are also much more raised today than before. We have the gender issues, we have the identity issues, even if in the introduction it was said like a word or like already, but still they're there and we're talking about it, and there's a lot of things still to be done. And this is no matter the musical genre and no matter the country, there's so much still to be done. So I would rather hope and think that the awareness will rise and hopefully be maybe cross-wrong.
Okay, just to because we're slowly running out of time, I'll approach the thing from a completely different perspective. I'll use Jacques Attali's thesis that music, not on a conscious, on a very reflexive level, is already announcing the state of things or society that's emerging, or the future society already. So I'll approach it this way, right? Let's feel the music, let's feel the vibes, and what music or what vibes would you, instinctively say could be a mobilizing force? Is it rap? Is it trap? Is it grime? Is it sound art?
I will give an example here, a very interesting example. It's a French example, but though it's interesting. It's the group PNL. I don't know if you have heard about it. It's a rap group which emerged a few years ago and which made a huge buzz and was listened as much from the youngsters from the banlieue to the upper higher class elite. And it's a group of rap, and this was really interesting to see how much suddenly in France a group of rap they refuse any kind of interview. It's very difficult to look up what they're saying, their position, but suddenly you see that it's a genre which apparently talks to all kind of different social class. So we go back to the social class thing, and for me it was quite impressive. And I don't know, I'm looking in that direction to see also different movements. And maybe I would answer with the rap.
I would be more historical here. I would say observing social protests, big strike actually, big revolt against our neoliberal government 4 or 5 years ago. The common denominator of and possible integrator of all different scenes and tastes was dub music. Dub was a historically very hermetical, but absolutely working class music actually, with hermetic power, and you couldn't assimilate in the time when it was produced, like in King Tubby's studio or later. So this was one common denominator. About utopias and heterotopias, implicitly in your question, I mean, class compromise after Second World War is over 2 or 3 decades ago, at least in 1889, mostly in Europe and Western world too. So all social benefits, welfare state, healthcare, even consensus that art, humanities, healthcare, public education is something which should be cherished, now is under severe attack. we now live, and we've been living with a big motto, big proclamation of cutbacks and all these measures in our minds for many years. I've been experiencing that in the 80s during Yugoslavia. But I mean, regarding about utopias, if you look back, I mean, the whole social democracies in that time with the welfare state, which was a compromise, by the way, after the Second World War, of compromise between labor and capital, including arts, now looks retroactively as really realized utopia compared to nowadays time. That's really depressing. It is depressing. I still believe in arts and thought and accumulation of knowledge as something that could move something in the society, but the prospects are not good. Remember the last crisis in 2008 and really shameful bailout of the banks from the states. Now JP Morgan, this is the last one, a few weeks ago proclaimed that another financial crash is coming. And JP Morgan, by the way, is very conservative, but very serious bank, actually, and a big player. But they are quite serious in predictions. In 2020, they proclaimed that another serious crash is coming. Of course, they will be bailed out. What? I mean, where is the art here? I mean, our only exit here, very intimate, I'm here quite pessimistic. But on the other hand, all artistic movements in the past and now, self-organizing, always give us some kind of optimism. It doesn't matter which kind of music you're talking about, electronic, sound art, whatever, always referring to the past. But about the piece, I still, as a contemporary piece, which is class struggle piece par excellence, I would say Frederick Rzewski, El Pueblo Unido, People United Will Never Be Defeated, his 25 movements long piano piece, avant-garde piece, is one of the best to remember. It is actually by composer who is also doing electronics in his time, and he's still doing it. He's now almost 80 years old. Or I would suggest for the next Sonica organizers, would you let's say, we give you one theme to elaborate, and I would give him one old piece from the late 19th century. I would like to see how as a sound art would sound, some motives. It's a very ordinary piece, It's called the Internationale.
Well, first thing I would say in response to that, I mean, JP Morgan was one of the principal actors of the 2008 crash. Of course. I think the big issue holding back a lot of organizing in terms of trying to bring together the class struggle is the nature of capitalism in the United States. It has taken on, it is best demonstrated in social media, which, by and large, I still consider a mistake. But it's basically what the issue is that everything has become the term I would like to use is atomized. Everything is boiled down to the individual unit. Everything is sold to the individual unit through marketing methods such as personalization or using data from people's profiles or even from their phone numbers, just identifying their locations and just marketing to them, giving them material that they would like to read or giving them material that they would like to watch on YouTube. And the problem with that, of course, is that when you start to atomize the individual, they just start looking inward. They don't really trust other people. They only seem to trust themselves, and they take on this sort of ontological perspective. And that creates a lot of issues because suddenly a lot of identity politics, for example, takes a very minor thing and elevates it to this catastrophic, life-threatening issue. And it's like, well, that's not really the case, but because people are looking so inward, they can't see beyond that. They can't escape the mirror. And it's a big risk that is going to be it's a big issue to take this on. At the same time, I'm a little more hopeful about the future to some degree. The 2016 election was the very first time in living memory that, to give an example, a candidate who, for our European audience here, probably wouldn't qualify as anything more than like a center leftist or someone who would work in the local Labour Party, was able to proclaim himself a democratic socialist. And for the first time, people were like, oh, that's cool. That's great. Like, before that, you were either laughed out of the house or you would be attacked until they couldn't find you. And I think part of that is the legacy of the Occupy movement back in 2011. But part of that is just simply that people are starting to, like, now that the Cold War has ended, and now that we are seeing the impacts of free market capitalism starting to damage the very fabrics of society, people are starting to look at these left-wing ideas now and saying that, you know what, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe this, what's the worst that can happen, you know? And I think in the context of the DIY scene, I think the most important thing is not just political awareness, but starting to connect with other scenes as much as possible. To revisit like the DIY period of like the post, like during the 90s, when it was a far more widespread network back then, when you had scenes like in Providence, Rhode Island, in Athens, Georgia, in Baltimore, in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and all these other little places. There was this small informal network where you could do a show, go on tour, spread your ideas. And I think there is still potential for that, and I still see it. Because I think, as much as I've sounded a pessimist throughout this entire talk, like the one thing that I've learned from my contacts in the DIY scene in North America is that DIY is doing really well. Even in the aftermath of the ghost ship fire in Oakland 2 years ago, which I have a personal connection with. One of the victims was my friend's brother. It has, in some ways, it has done little to change things, but in some ways, the fact that it has not caused a catastrophic change outside of a few venues closing, like, for example, the acclaimed Rhinoceropolis in Denver having shut down, the fact that there was a minimal impact in that respect meant that there was a lot greater strength in DIY in the United States than people realize. And honestly, that's a good thing. I think there's a great potential to to redevelop these networks, because things are thriving. Things in a way are thriving right now, and I think that's going to be the direction that we can take despite all these conflicts.
I would like to add something. If we don't talk in terms of, let's say, social class or the living of the musician and so on, but only in terms of the creativity, the potential of inspiration today, I would say we are in a very good time. Never before there was so much opportunities to reach out to get inspiration from other places, to get influences from places where before it was impossible to get the influences from. So in this kind of, in this perspective, I would say I'm rather optimistic, because like everything is mixing up, everything is influencing each other. There's so many potential, so many things which can emerge. So from this perspective, like what we still can get from musicians, from the arts, is huge, is absolutely huge.
One thing I observed when I was doing research in New York is what later I was trying to call gentrifying of new music, new experimental music, gentrification of new experimental music. Why? And this is perhaps one objection or perhaps complementary answer to your I agree with some of your points, but I would like to point to some of the new experimentalist, new music we are talking mostly about here. Access to education and to the very art scenes were much more open, because of course they are in one first of all, in past years, or let's say 20 years ago, generation born before 1980 or 1985, they were part of the social welfare. They can get scholarship from all layers of the social layers of society. Now, especially in the field of music, when let's say great education is required, especially in composition, in real or something else, there you can find out that mostly they come from middle classes.
Yeah,
Mostly from upper classes, so because they cannot get scholarship, or they came from the poor families, or I would say working class families with special attachment to the, let's say, musical culture.
But it depends which kind of music you talk.
I know what, of course. So and when I was talking, I'm talking about music which is close to, I mean, jazz, experimental, free improvisation, even free phonic improvisation, whatever. So it was part. That's for sure. Opportunities you're talking about, of course, they are greater. Yeah, for one layer of society, or perhaps. But one thing which I'd like to point out is that for the lower classes, or even for working classes, immigrant working communities, the only opportunities now, actually, how to survive without and with attempts for better social mobility, how to say, is actually the field of sport and culture, or music, popular music especially. So we have to take this very seriously. I'm not denying your point, but this is very serious. And sportification of everyday life is everywhere, actually. Go to Africa. You won't hear African musicians so much more on the streets, but you will see kids with Ronaldo 7 on their back, or with or Messi, or even in Asia. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, though, I mean, okay, we would start a new debate if we really go into this. But I mean, of course, like the question of composition and if it requires certain knowledge is, again, it's the question of social class or who has access to it. But internet in general, all over the world, internet, like the normal access to internet on the speed we're talking today, later there's another question about the internet of tomorrow, is accessible in most regions of the world, or if not in every region of the world. So the influences, or if you want to dig into something, is accessible. Then there's another question of someone living in a remote place to have the mobility. This is for me it's related, but it's a different question, because the inspiration, you can get it, and then you have the question of making a living out of it, which is related to something else. But in terms of influences, of inspiration, just split or taken apart from the living, I would say we still have a lot to explore and a lot to share.
I agree with that. I was just trying to show where the obstacles are.
Yes, I do agree with you. Yes.
These are big obstacles.
Yeah, they're big. They're huge.
I mean, of course, every immigrant community, whatever is in Europe, southern, northern part of Europe, or states, Latin America, of course they try. they want to be socially mobile, upward mobile, of course, from their primary position, of course. But the music, in some way, especially experimental way, now we can talk what experimental means, of course. But of course, some channels are closing down for the certain social layers of possible potential music makers. So I don't deny your point, but this is one really big warning about. I mean, what is the reality in the States, but even in Europe now? It is indebted students, even musical students. If you're going to be indebted, you probably would like to school more. If you go to musical education institution, probably you would choose something else, perhaps auto engineering, computer, whatever, not the field of music.
No, but maybe, and then I just last point, and I shut up myself also. No. It's a nice example. It's electroshabi in Egypt, because they don't do it for having a living. So it's again also, I mean, it's great if you're an artist and if you're a musician and you can make a living out of it. Of course, it's the best situation ever, but it depends in which context. And sometimes it has to do more with political activism, somehow, to make music. And in the case of Egypt and electroshabi, it was also a very interesting movement. And it has to do with the revolution. And they didn't study music. They did it out of total different needs. So,
yeah, okay.
And now, just to bring up a point, first of all, indebted students, yes, that is a huge problem. I can attest to that. I think I got about 50,000 euros in debt still, maybe? I don't know. It's a lot.
Google, Facebook, any answers?
But I think something you bring up is that a lot of people are being pushed to specific fields, and in turn, these fields are trying to influence how things work. And there is a big risk of that. I think with the internet, there is always that sort of heavy risk involved of dealing with hegemonic business entities that was discussed a couple days ago at the talk with, I think it was James Ginsberg. The risk that you face with those is that there's a lot of unintended consequences when you deal with these hegemonic entities. Not so much like with stuff like Bandcamp or SoundCloud or what have you, in the risk of like you have to kind of stick with them, or even in the case of Patreon, where in certain fields there are increasing restrictions to fit the needs of, say, the sources of capital, if it's either through banks or through PayPal. And the other factor to that is because there's a lot of information going into one source, you run a risk of having these very these major bubbles. Like I remember this study once that was like very much talking about the benefits of social media, and they concluded that, oh yeah, social media has these benefits. This was a few years ago before the effects started taking a toll, but they made it an exception, and they made a point that social media only really works when the masses are together in function in terms of affecting political change. When these groups are much more divided, such as a tribal state, and that can be the case with certain music scenes, the effects are null or negative. And that leaves opportunities for exploiting situations. Many people talk about the election in the United States in 2016, but there's even better examples, such as the election in the Philippines, because that was an example of Facebook offering free internet. And because of that, a lot of influencers for Rodrigo Duterte, who is by many people in the Western world considered a strong man and somewhat bloodthirsty, his campaign was able to exploit the fact that this was often the only source of internet that a lot of Filipinos had access to, and consequently, they could control the narrative. So that is a big risk going into the future. And I think these industries are only starting to understand the influences they have over the popular mindset. And I think that is a bigger obstacle towards trying to reacquaint the ideas of class, especially in the context of music.
Okay. Along the right to the city, the right to social security, the right to freedoms, the right to internet as well. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
At this stage, yeah.
No, this about the internet is, I mean,
Just quickly. Yeah.
about big question about music, really, is about who will possess, who will own the music now, especially regarding internet, digital rights, and so on. I mean, the issue of copyrights and ownership of music is now really the biggest
It's complicated.
issue, the biggest issue now we are facing now.
Maybe we
Either
need
we are
some-
facing totalitarianism in copyright from the multi-corporations, or with the help of nation states, by the way, or communities like European Union, or total anarchy. That's another option, by the way. When even I would say small firms, investors in music, will not have anything to invest, because these are perhaps the biggest issues now. Who will own the music? I mean, really, through the property rights established through multi-trade agreements, which are now going on, and are less and less resisted, let's say, even in European Union. This is one very big issue regarding the internet and copyright laws.
Control of the IP, control of the narrative. It's all the same, really. I mean, I think a good example of this, and this plays back into identity politics, is I won't take long. Is very just before the Me Too movement had started picking up, back in early 2017, there was this band in Chicago that was identified as this queer punk band, goes by the name of Power Bottom, no vowels in their name, and through various social outlets, they were considered this up and coming representation of like, oh yes, queer bands are doing, this is a good example of like queer pride, etc., etc. And then news started coming out of the social networks, within the informal social networks, that the guys in this band, the people in this band, apologies, were sexual predators. And that immediately started to destroy their reputation. And I have no stake in this because I was not part of that particular scene to begin with. But it shows an impact of how, like, sometimes you don't control the narrative, and that can affect how you deliver music, like how you are able to reach out to the population, how you reach out to your audience. But that's it.
I guess we've not saved the world. Oh shit! But I think platforms where we have creativity, innovation, experimentation, inclusivity, diversity, mobility, interconnectedness, but also spaces where bodies come together. Because if we consume stuff digitally, I don't think we'll literally create a movement. It's not a movement. It's just a group of people, right? It's a good start, I think. And at this point, I'm going to pass the mic on to all of you. Questions, comments. There we go.
I just quickly wanted to bring something in. I think the most important question is that we as cultural workers, no matter if we are like organizing concerts or if we are musicians, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what role do we play in nowadays capitalism? And I think I read a few years ago, and it's quite difficult for me to elaborate on that in English, but I will try. A few years ago, I read a book which was like really enlightening. It's The New Spirit of Capitalism by Luc Boltanski and 𝐏𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐊. And I think it's still very informative, because basically what is said in there, to make it like very, very, very short, So the 68 or the reaction of capitalism towards the 68 movement was like there were like two forms of critique. There was like the creative critique and the social critique. And the creative critique, this had to do with Fordism and like this very monotone working cycles in the factories and so on. So what happened was that this form of critique was incorporated by the capitalism. So like to be a super mobile, creative person who can do whatever they want, express your ideas, and so on and so forth. So what we have nowadays, this was like incorporated by capitalism. And actually, I mean, this is known for a few years now, that artists and cultural workers, we are the perfect role model for like the so-called Me-Inc. or 𝐏𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐊, as it's called in German. And like a lot of other professions followed actually, because like the creative person, it's like put that it's so great. You can nowadays you can decide by yourself. You can be your own company. You can be creative, mobile, work from at home or from the swimming pool or from wherever. But like what happened in this whole phase is that the social critique, this was all on the cost of the social critique. And I think that still a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, we are the driving force here. And like the only way I think to react on that is, yeah, as you said, I mean, international, or like really like get together again and insist on our social rights, like try to gain that back, what we lost in the last years.
If I may answer, this is a common problem within the case of social movements, especially in the United States, which is why there's this interesting conflict that exists between people who very much support identity politics in conflict with people who have more of a understanding of class politics, while they're not entirely against identity politics. Because the thing with a lot of the former group is that you see this group being much more accommodating to the forces of capital. You see this group they have very specific demands, but these social demands have little to do with their class. It's more to assume their identity. This makes them far more susceptible to forces of capital in the forms of co-option and in the forms of just trying to integrate and assimilate these marginalized groups. I mean, a great example of this I saw recently was somebody posted up all these tweets from the LGBT organization known as Human Rights Campaign. And basically, they showed tweets about how all these corporations were being very supportive of LGBT interests, but it's the same groups that are very much threatening to the masses, either as banks or as financial institutions or as defense contractors and weapons suppliers. Like, it creates this sort of dissonance that, you know, looks really weird, and you're just like, why? But a lot of organizations, often, and especially in America, they tend to fall prey to that. Which is why I'm grateful that this development occurred in 2016, because now we have the means of which to actually stand against that and avoid the temptations, even though it is still extremely difficult. I'm not going to say that everything is all right in that respect. It's still going to be a challenge. But I would say it's much better that we're starting to recognize these things as happening. I think that's going to be the major source of conflict when it comes to that sort of thing.
One thing about 68, about Boltanski, And well, I would like to add, when I was talking about new trade union syndicalist movements as a part of the social movement and labor movements in '68 and especially in the late '60s. And that is a big problem, especially in the States, less so in Europe, but also in Europe. Actually, labor units reacted to various social movements, whether they were movement for the civil rights in the States, or green movement, or ecologist movement, feminist movement, gay movement, whatever. They were extremely conservative. They reacted extremely conservative to that movements, and parallel. And I will put into the parallel, in the field of music, they reacted the same towards the various forms of popular music or non-popular popular music. And there were actually late attempts to change this from below, from the grassroots, with the members of do-it-yourself scenes, independent musical formations, to do it with this vertical organization like Musicians Union. But as I say, this Emanuel Wallenstein 5-6 years ago wrote excellent article about possibilities of return of trade unions, of syndicalist movement. And I would like to apply it also to the music or art scenes. His variant was like, we have two, this is generalization of course, we have strong monolith labor movements embodied in syndicates or trade unions. They are very verticalist, but they could be mobilized because of the membership. You have syndicalist, almost anarchic syndicalist organization, like also in music, like do-it-yourself scene. They have perhaps, they think more strategically on London terms, how to integrate this kind of two, and perhaps there is a solution. Because, as you said, and Boltanski and Luc Boltanski and what is the other author show that, I mean, the motto, which was very and still very important politically, personally political, it's not enough. Absolutely, it was very important and still very important, but it is not enough. One way of it actually goes and evolving into very narcissistic reflection of our artistic work. That's dangerous.
I would just like to make a short rejoinder to what is being said here. You are definitely correct. There was a lot of conservatism in the labor movement in the 1960s, but in America specifically, there was a reason for that. Starting with 1948 with the Taft-Hartley Act, the labor... It was 47, yes, sorry. Thanks for correcting me there. I'm getting my dates a little wrong there. But starting with the Taft-Hartley Act, but with all these other... and starting with going into HUAC and McCarthyism, the labor movement moved very strategically to suppress left-wing elements, so that by the 1960s, they were just gone. And that's why the reaction occurred the way it did towards these new movements, social movements in the 1960s. And that is actually one of the great tragedies of the time, because ultimately, this sort of division prevented all these groups from coming together as a form of class politics, and those divisions still remain to this day.
I have nothing special to say about labor movements.
Do I see Shape and ICAS forming a union?
I mean, even within our group, I think there is a big confusion. About how critical should we be towards the so-called creative industries. Now we have even the cultural program of the European Union is now called Creative Europe. So I think there is an awareness. I mean, it's also maybe a lack of resources, to really react towards that. Because, of course, as a cultural organizer, you need money, you need funding. So you're very likely to tap into this systems of, for example, creative industry, although this system is actually actually you are, yeah, is how to say, it makes that you have a precarious existence, you know. So I think it's very difficult, and like this thing that you need at least 3 jobs to make your living and everything, and that you have like not enough time to reflect. I mean, this is all somehow coming together. So I think it's like not easy to get organized and find a way to change things here. But definitely, yeah, it should be discussed once over and over again, and hopefully finally we will come up with something. I mean, we as like all the creative class, as Richard Florida put it, to also throw in this like term, because yeah.
I just find it, I mean, it's the history of labor movements is of course very interesting, and they brought so much, but it's very complicated to totally make, how to say, a projection, or even to relate to make a relation between labor movement and creativity in the creativity sector, because unfortunately when we talk about creative sector we talk about also capitalism. So, and the labor movement is basically try to counterpart the capitalism. So we should then within the creative sector try to define what would be the ground and where we want to go through, and if it's about like just make some basic statements and think in general. But I see there, like, I'm kind of pessimistic, but because I don't see how we could do that.
In relation to the 68 movements and to today, I would suggest everyone to read the Critique of Society and Critique of Economy by Bellofiore, which is, it's about, I mean, a word that is missing here a bit too much, I think, it's the word student, and the big struggle that was in the political movements between workers' movements and student movements. And that same problem, which Bellofiore tried to formalize in this moment of the 68, actually, is a problem that we're facing now, and that has to be reread and resolved locally. Something that was very interesting for me during this panel is we have 3 different backgrounds, and it's very difficult, I believe, to start finding solution top-down, especially if you are aware of the regional differences. Some things are very common to every place. I believe tonight we're going to go see a concert in a space that is going to be probably gentrified and destroyed. In Ljubljana, in Berlin, we see the same. In Milano, we see the same today. $22 million to destroy Macau. Google is moving to Berlin. I mean, there are some things that are similar. But still, I'm asking myself, shouldn't we go back to the real leftist ghost, which is the struggle between student movement and workers' movement? Understand, try to find a way to, yes, have a class, but a conscious class. A class that is an inclusive class. And I mean, I speak from my experience, the space we have is not in an immigrant majority neighborhood in Berlin. It's in a very German place, where 27% voters are AfD and 32% are Die Linke. And where the people living there have steady jobs, have unions, have Hartz IV, have stuff like that. And the people who do what we do, although coming from a background that is maybe more middle class and so on, are now in a professional situation which is not represented as much as that. So I mean, I think the problem is very complex, but has to be seen. I was looking for in this panel to discover more what the solution could be in Ljubljana, for Ljubljana, by Ljubljana, because I'm here. because I see myself discovering problems that I see at home in Berlin, and that I see a city looking for maybe solutions from outside, but I think we can't give any solution. I think we still have to teach. Maybe I think I'm learning more from Ljubljana than from Berlin in that sense.
I think it's impossible to give solutions, especially, I mean, I didn't plan to be on a panel to give solutions because I have no idea how to give any solutions. But I don't know Ljubljana neither, but I guess there's like in every big city, or maybe even less big city, but there are common fights, common struggles, and we see it talking about gentrification, talking about many, like the rise of rent, etc. There's like so many common fights we have nowadays, so it's more like maybe trying to understand what's going on, and I think we're not able, as like on a panel, to talk about the solution, but just like to give, for those who are listening, inputs to like to think on and to think for the city they're living in. But unfortunately, I cannot give more than that.
And I think I'm kind of in agreement with this, especially because coming from my American background, the student movements in the United States are a lot different. There's not a lot of class consciousness involved in these situations. But that said, what I have seen work is just finding a common thread to attach to and building up from there. Like the protests in, I believe it was Sao Paulo, quite a few years ago, that threatened Brazil's World Cup, Brazil having the World Cup. Those were started out on something as simple as raising the fares of a bus. Like, it can be very simple to just start with something and just build out from there. And in the case of Ljubljana, it's a matter of finding out what issue is deeply affecting the city. And sometimes it's just something that seems so minor that could be a common thread that starts building things up.
Be careful, we have to resist the all-seeing eye.
I'll be
this is
very, very short.
So you have any very good...
10 years ago, in the call for the public subsidies from the municipality of Ljubljana, I noticed, and I was public critic of that action. In the some conditions for the gaining the public subsidy from the municipality of Ljubljana was public intervention in the space for the purpose of revitalization of degraded buildings in the city. And then it became a kind of sport of artistic, even musical groups and festivals that, I mean, revitalization of degrading parts of the city was part of their artistic activity. In the same time, in the barracks of Metelka, that became autonomous squad of special sort, this kind of solution was already solved. They built autonomous cultural and political and social zone when the city actually invited artists to reinvigorate or revitalize some parts in the very center of the city. And when artists accepted that, I was strongly against that, because they accepted the logic of new, let's say, creative industry city, whatever, which this city actually just copy from the EU or in whatever documents. But the practice, social practice of artists, culture, various social groups in the very city actually was quite different. That was it.
Yeah, I would just like to add one thing. I think the word creative industry is maybe the big problem. We shouldn't use at all the word industry talking about create. Or if we use it, we have to be aware that then you tap into exactly the capitalist model, and that you tap into actually legitimating all kinds of gentrification through Google and so on. And so well, I have my big problems with creative industry, and so that's just to close up.
Okay, for more on Metelkova and Rog, we'll be at Rog tonight, right? We can share notes, and I suggest we share them offline, because let's not give the good hints and good strategies to those watching out there. And this. So thank you, each of Vidmar. Thank you, Sean Brady, and thank you, Sarah. Again, the German pronunciation, Lauzemis. There we go. Thank you for listening, and I'm sure the discussion will go on. Thank you. This has been the last round table at Sonica 10th Anniversary Edition. Bye, Google.